topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we've not met yet or you don't know me, I'm a management consultant and organizational logotherapist specializing in meaning and purpose. My team and I help companies to detect and articulate their purpose to thread it through culture and operations. We work with forward-reaching organizations to develop inspirational leaders who create cultures where people actually want to come to work and do their best. And we provide programs that enable individual team members and leaders to discover and unleash their passion and purpose at work to catalyze fulfillment, engagement, and productivity. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at elisecortez.com. Also, if you like the content of this show, then you may also be interested in my next book coming out in March of 23. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. You can pre-order your copy at bookshop.org or barnesandnoble.com. Now, let's get into today's program. With us today is Dr. Wendy Smith, the Dana J. Johnson Professor of Management and Faculty Director of the Women's Leadership Initiative at the Lerner College of Business and Economics, University of Delaware. She has taught at the University of Delaware, Harvard University, and the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton, while helping senior leaders and middle managers all over the world address issues of interpersonal dynamics, team performance, organizational change, and innovation. She is the co-author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems, which is the subject of our conversation today. She joins today from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Smith, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
You're so welcome. Now let's just start by showing this beautiful thing that you created. Look at this gorgeous book. Look, listeners, viewers, it's so gorgeous. Well, anyway, I think it's just tremendous. And so I'm looking forward to sharing it. And so let's dive in. First, you wrote a book about paradoxes. Let's just say, you had to tackle on, the easiest subject in the world, didn't you? So let's start by situating, what do you mean by paradox?
Yeah, I love that. And I love that we're diving right into paradox, because that is what gripped me in this idea, was what this complex, kind of abstract, kind of irrational idea that has real impact on our lives. And, maybe what I should do is actually take one step back and start by telling you how I got into this.
That'd be great.
So I've been researching this idea of paradox for like 20, 25 years now. And they say that research is me search. And I was finding myself in the midst of all of these either or decisions, these sort of dilemmas, trade-offs one of which was, do I become an academic, in which case I study issues, or do I go out in the world and really make a difference in the world and have impact and be a leader and be somebody who can actually do something with these ideas? And that felt like a massive either or to me. Mm-hmm. The idea of paradox is that underlying these either ors, these trade-offs that we feel in our lives, these trade-offs that leaders have to make, are these interwoven opposites that are interdependent. And if we refocus on these interwoven, interdependent contradictions, we can actually rethink our dilemmas and come up with better solutions. And it's everything from love and hate, or focusing on today and focusing on tomorrow, the short term and the long term, or self and other. It is these dualities that actually, if we look at them deeply, they're not just, in conflict with each other, they also reinforce each other.
So would you identify yourself as a scholar practitioner in both of those worlds then?
Now I do. Now what I got to realize, what I was able to realize was that by studying these ideas, I actually get to have impact in a whole different way. And it was through this lens of paradox, I realized that I was thinking about the decision in a way that was really limiting.
See, that's what's happened for me too. A similar path. I'm not in a university, of course. I used to teach at universities, but similar. So we're scholars and practitioners. Thank you very much. And we're both wearing turquoise.
Leaders are also scholars in their own way. They're thinking
right.
about ideas. They're generating hypotheses. They're testing them. They're experimenting them. Maybe not in the same way that I do in the university, but our identities and our roles don't have to hold us back for what's possible.
Okay, now with that foundation in place, let's hear your definition of a paradox.
Yeah, so we say paradoxes are persistent, interdependent contradictions. And we break it down into each of those three pieces. So these contradictions, they're dualities, they conflict with each other, and that they create these tensions. I mean, the truth is that figuring out whether I'm going to spend more time with my family or more time at work, it's a real question in which there's a conflict over my time, and yet they are interdependent. So that the more that I take care of myself, the better I am at taking care of someone else. The more that I actually started studying this in the context of how leaders navigate the tension of innovation and the tension between focusing on today and focusing on tomorrow. So they were facing these ongoing contradictions of where to put their money or how to organize, and yet the more that they thought about tomorrow, the more energy that they had to navigate today, and the more successful they were with their existing products today, the more that they had resources to fuel tomorrow. These things could lead to a virtuous cycle. And the last component is that they are persistent. And the important thing here is that the tension between self and other today and tomorrow, they never go away. Right. They might show up in different ways in our lives, but they never go away. So that invites us into thinking the challenge then, the invitation, if you will, is not to solve our paradoxes. It's to navigate them. It's to live in them. It's to engage with them.
Yummy, all just yummy stuff. Now we have kind of a nice little purview into that mind of yours. Thank you very much for opening that up for us. So I want to dig deeper and just continue to peel back the onion, because there's so much great material in your book, Wendy. It's just amazing. So you talk about 4 types of paradoxes that you've identified. Let's talk about each one of those.
Yeah, and the important thing here is, and we've been doing this research, this was from research that I've been doing with my colleague, Marianne Lewis, my co-author, Marianne Lewis, for years. So we talk about these 4 types of paradoxes: organizing, belonging, coordinating, and performing, learning, organizing, belonging. We actually translate those into 4 types of paradoxes for leaders and the types of paradoxes that show up in organizations. Each of these are different types of paradoxes. And I can walk through a little bit of these different types.
That'd be great.
What I think is important here is that it shows the breadth of the way that paradoxes show up. So it's less important that you categorize your paradox into a particular bucket and know that they show up in these different ways, right? So organizing paradoxes are the tensions between trying to be very planful versus letting things be emergent. Am I spontaneous and letting things emerge, or am I going to plan things out? It's the tensions that show up between trying to be cooperative and being competitive, and the ongoing tensions there. Performing paradoxes are paradoxes that show up in our outcomes, in our why we do things. And so performing paradoxes might have to do with, am I focusing on myself or someone else? Am I focusing on an outcome that is short-term or long-term? Learning paradoxes have to do with growth and time, things like focusing on today versus focusing on tomorrow. And belonging paradoxes are paradoxes of identity, or who am I? And these are the tensions that show up when we focus on our role, work versus life, those kinds of tensions. And what you'll notice is that these tensions show up in all different places in our lives. You know, when I was a doctoral student, I went into my advisors. I said, I think the whole world is paradoxical. And my advisor said, oh no, we've got some problems here in getting it. But I do actually, you know, Marianne and I will often say to each other, like, the more that you see paradoxes, the more you see paradoxes in our world.
It's a beautiful insight in your unique view on the world that now gives us access. So even just when you share those 4 types, what I hoped would happen, Wendy, is people would start to get present to their own as we continue the conversation, right? Yeah. So then, of course, it's one thing to know our paradoxes, and then it's another thing to do something about them, do something with them. So I want to talk a little bit about the paradox system that you've created to both enable and thinking. It's an actual beautiful system. It's gorgeous.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. One of the reasons we wrote this book is because when I initially started on this work, we had to convince people that there was an important shift from thinking about either or to thinking about both and. Now we see both and all over the place. And the reason we wrote this book is because we have been working with a community of scholars doing excellent research that moves us away from both and as a label, like, yeah, let's both and, to really dig deep of how do we do this stuff.
Yeah.
So we pulled together that research into what we call the paradox system, importantly, pointing to 4 different sets of tools that help people actually navigate paradox. And the important thing here is that it's not picking 1 or 2 of these tools. It's about thinking about how they work together. So oftentimes when you hear people talk about both and, they'll talk about changing their mindset. So that's one of the tools, is how we think about things. We talk about that as assumptions. And importantly, it's not just how we think about things, it's also our emotions. Navigating this stuff is hard. It's emotional. We get defensive. We get upset. We get anxious. And in order to be able to live into paradox, to engage with it, we have to be able to, what we say, find comfort in the discomfort. So it's both head and heart. And what we notice about those 2 skills is it's about how the individual engages. And sometimes those are in opposition with one another. The head and the heart are sometimes in conflict, but they have to work together. The other 2 are about how we navigate our context around us, the environments that we're in. And we talk about creating boundaries, which are, in part, and this is exactly where we speak right into your work, which is around purpose. Purpose is a structural thing, or we talk about it as structural, that really enables people to be motivated to navigate paradox.
Yes.
And in addition to the purpose, we also talk about having guardrails so that you don't go too far if you're thinking about work and life, or today and tomorrow, or managing profit and people and planet, that you don't go too far in one direction or the other. So you have guardrails. So those are the boundaries. And then the final component we talk about is dynamics, being able to be dynamic and experimental and try new things over time as you navigate paradox. So nicely, we label these in an ABCD mnemonic. So it's assumptions, how you think; the boundaries, the structures you create around you; C, comfort, the emotions of how you navigate paradox; and D, dynamics, the experimentation and ongoing change and flexibility and agility.
You can so articulate concepts so beautifully. Your students must love you, and so much must your clients. It's just beautiful. Thank you, Wendy. Just so accessible.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So then, we're talking about tensions, right? A lot of this, what's underlying all of this, is tensions. But then you go on to talk about this thing called knotting. So talk to us a bit about knotting.
Yeah. So paradox 1.0 is to accept that that we can move beyond either ors and this rational either or decision and move into seeing opposing ideas interwoven. That's kind of the first stop. And some people say, yeah, I get that. Well, the second stop is to realize that actually these paradoxical tensions are interwoven with one another. So we could say, look, I'm dealing with this identity tension of career person versus family person, but interwoven with that is short-term and long-term. What am I going to do right now? What am I going to do in the future? How do I think about the future informing what I'm going to do right now? There's interwoven with that is a performing learning paradox, the tension between, do I do things right now that I'm really good at, or do I make myself feel vulnerable and try new things and learn for the future? So all of these tensions are interwoven with one another. So again, paradox 1.0 is we take these opposing ideas and see how they're related with each other. Paradox 2.0 is that these paradoxes are interwoven and there's multiple of these. So my colleague Marianne and I would sometimes sit down and we swear, oh, we totally understand what we're talking about. And then the idea would get slippery because it's complex. The more it's the paradox of knowledge. The more you know you don't know. And you've got to keep digging to really get your head around it.
It's so accessible the way you explained it. And listeners and viewers, just so we're clear, that word nodding that I was talking about is KNOTTING,
right.
Nodding.
Right, knot.
Right.
And actually our colleagues talk about it as like the image of the Gordian knot, the Irish Gordian knot, that you can see multiple strands interwoven with each other.
That's a great metaphor right there, or analogy maybe. Okay, so now we have to talk about the two patterns of both and thinking that you described. I think they're just positively delightful, incredibly unique. So first, finding a mule. I've never heard anything remotely close to this, Wendy. Finding a mule.
Right. Well, so we talk about two different ways of navigating these interwoven opposites. And finding a mule is actually the way that people tend to think if they're going to think about a both and. They think, oh, a both and means that it's always a win-win, a creative integration. Both sides get exactly what they want. And that is great and ideal. And we call it finding a mule because the mule is this biological hybrid that's stronger than a horse, smarter than a donkey. Bring them together and you've got a better option, and this sort of hybrid option. And that's great, but it doesn't happen all the time. It actually happens less than we think. And in fact, I'll just say very quickly, I started studying these ideas because I was studying how the senior leaders of business units, strategic business units at IBM, were navigating this tension between today and tomorrow. And they were talking about needing to do both. And I kept expecting to see all these strategic business units find ways that the old and the new came together in these beautiful synergies. And the truth is that happened less often. It happens sometimes, but rarely. And in fact, and I don't know if this is where you're going, which is to the other pattern, because that's what happens more often.
Okay. The tightrope walker. What another great name.
The tightrope walker. That and part of thinking about that was from this IBM study, because the leaders that were doing this well, that were innovating well, that were managing the paradox of today and tomorrow well, what they were doing is that they were looking at each of the decisions that they had to make. Where do I put my resources? How do I allocate my engineers? How do I think about structures for my team? And they were shifting very frequently between allocating to the existing product and allocating to the innovation. And the reason that we use the metaphor of the tightrope walker is because if you think about a tightrope walker, it's not that they're waffling and stuck. They're going forward. They're looking to the future of where they want to get. To get there, they're never fully balanced. They're always balancing. So they're always sort of making these micro shifts left and right. What they're not doing is overemphasizing one side or overemphasizing the other where they're going to fall off. So if we think about the decisions that leaders need to make or the decisions that individuals need to make, like I use the example in the book of work life when I think about this, because the ideal creative integration in work life, when my twins were born 16 years ago, the ideal creative integration was I was going to go open up a daycare, work would be life would be work. But that was not really on my agenda. And instead, to be able to live into both being career-oriented and family-oriented, I'm constantly making these micro decisions. And part of that, we talk about it as being consistently inconsistent, because one of the things that holds us back, and one of the things we know from psychology, is that people don't like to be inconsistent. So part of this is about being able to live into and accept that inconsistency is valuable.
Beautifully explained, Dr. Wendy Smith. Just beautiful. Let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on air with Dr. Wendy Smith. She's the co-author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. We've been talking a bit about some of the basic concepts that undergird her book. After the break, we're going to get more into the application of how to use her tools. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us. Before we get back into the program, I want to take a moment to invite you to check out my book, Purpose Ignited, How Inspiring Leaders Ignite Passion and Elevate Cause. It's on Amazon now. I really wrote that book to awaken the readers to their passion and purpose and start them down the path of becoming an inspirational leader. And I use it as the basis for my program, so I hope you'll check it out. If you're just now joining the program today, my guest is Dr. Wendy Smith. She is the Dana J. Johnson Professor of Management and Faculty Director of the Women's Leadership Initiative at the Lerner College of Business and Economics, University of Delaware. She is the co-author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So now as we get further into this, Wendy, here, we've been peeling back so beautifully how you're helping us use this stuff. I want to get into this interesting concept you call the S-curve in dealing with paradox. Talk to us a bit about that.
I love that. And we give credit. There's a number of people in management theory that have talked about this. One of them is Charles Handy, who wrote this beautiful book, The Age of Paradox, in 1991. And the idea of the S-curve is that over time, we enable our skills until our skills are no longer useful. And the question is, when do we change? Most people will change at the point where they start to fall off the S-curve, where their skills really are no longer useful. But the question is, can we change? Can we retool? Can we redevelop? Can we innovate at the point where we're moving up the S-curve, at the point where we're at the highest level of our success, in order to start building up the next S-curve? That requires us to be living in what we do well at the same time that we are willing to explode what we do well, break it up, and try something new, doing both of those at the same time. And we see this in individuals, but we also see this pretty profoundly in organizations. The organizations that are it is easiest to change when you are failing. And the organizations that are most poised to effectively change are the ones to do it at the top of their success, where they see opportunity and possibility. But that's the best time to change. It's the hardest time to change because you don't get people motivated that we got to get something done.
I totally recognize that S-curve in both my personal and my professional life. So thank you for giving me access to really understand just what was going on there. Thank you for that. Now, if we go on to this notion of vicious cycles, so that I found fascinating your 3 patterns that you identified that lead to these vicious cycles when navigating paradoxes. I think this is useful too for our listeners and viewers, because if we're going to send them into, jumping into both and, let's help them along as they encounter this stuff.
Yeah. Vicious cycles happen when we extensively engage in either or thinking. That what we say about either or thinking is that it's great for the short term, but over time it's limited at best and detrimental at worst. And it's detrimental because we end up in these 3 patterns. The first is that we get really stuck in what we've always done, that it's hard to change. We talk about that as falling down a rabbit hole. And that might be that's the issue with the S-curve. We're really stuck in our existing job, role, competencies, identities, that we're not willing to play with and experiment with new things. It's harder to do that. We get emotionally stuck, cognitively stuck. We get stuck in our habits. Change is hard. So we talk about that as falling down a rabbit hole or intensification. Then if we fall so hard down the rabbit hole, and this is kind of what it means to fall off the other side of the S-curve, the environment changes around us, we have to change. And what often ends up happening is that we swing all the way back to the other side of the competing demands. So what that would look like, we give the example in the book of Lego. Lego, like many, many companies, intensified around the brick, the interlocking brick. They wouldn't innovate. They, like many companies, started to fail when toys became all about mechanical and electronic or whatever, and started to fail. And then Lego actually overcorrected, which is what we call it, this wrecking ball that sort of wrecks all the good with the bad. They over innovated. And it was actually at that point that they almost went bankrupt, because they were innovating on so many fronts that while they were bringing in new revenues, their costs were skyrocketing.
Yep.
So, and we see this kind of yo-yoing. I mean, people who have ever dieted and sort of this discipline, extensive discipline, and then you're like, oh, I've just got to like take a break, and you're kind of going back and forth in this kind of overcorrecting way. So that's the second pattern. And the third pattern, and this is something that we've been talking a lot about because we see this so poignantly in personal relationships, in organizations, and particularly in the political world we live in, which is when one side intensifies on one point of view, the other side intensifies on the other point of view, and you're stuck in this polarized conflict. And we talk about that as trench warfare, because what we often see is that we've dehumanized, we dig our own trenches deeper to, reinforce what we believe and to surround ourselves with other people that reinforce our beliefs. And then we sort of shoot out at the other side, dehumanizing them without fully understanding, taking the time to be curious and respectful and understand what the other side believes. And what we say in those polarizing trench warfare situations is that mostly all you end up with is a lot of casualties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recognize that particular pattern, certainly in our politics, certainly in various companies that I've consulted with as well. And again, what I'm hoping, what I'm wanting, what I'm trying to pull for this conversation is that we give our listeners and viewers greater access to the stuff so they can start to recognize it and then better navigate through it. So gorgeous. Thank you. Right. And it's one of the things one of the places where you shine. So now if we can get further into the idea of assumptions that form the mindsets and the cognition that inform our action. This is so interesting to really get under the hood, if you will, of this stuff. So you then talk about the opportunity to address assumptions in 3 core areas. And aren't we all just a walking mix of assumptions?
Right. And so one of the things we hear a lot about paradox is you got to change your mindset. So that is the first stop. And here, I want to just pause for a second before talking about these 3 areas, because sometimes people will say to us, well, it's really hard to engage with paradox, or how do we get started, or how do we get started with both and thinking? And what we often say is the first step is changing the question, because changing the question will change how you think about the issues. So instead of asking the either or question, am I an academic or a practitioner? Am I family focused or career focused? Am I going to focus on today or tomorrow in my business? Am I a profit or nonprofit? If you switch the question to how can I both engage in scholarship and engage in practice and impact? How can I both think about my bottom line and be concerned about people and planet? That opens up all kinds of new possibilities. And then, when we talk about what has to change, well, we have to change the way we think about right and wrong, truth and that there could be right and right. We have to change the way we think about our resources from zero-sum scarce resources to abundant. And we have to think about, and this is kind of the most obscure, but probably the most important, which is that both and thinking invites us to move away from I can control the situation, which requires us to make a decision, to I can cope with whatever comes my way and constantly be experimenting and trying new things.
That just reminds me, Wendy, I had Stephen M. R. Covey on my show talking about his new book, Trust and Inspire. That smacks right of what you're talking about there. Move away from command and control, step into trust and inspire. Similar sort of paradigm, if you will. Fascinating. Love it. Okay, then I'm fascinated to your talk about boundaries. So you say boundaries are the structures, practices, and people that we put in place to support our ability to navigate paradox. That's just a fascinating idea in and of itself. And then, of course, you list 3. So let's talk about those.
Yeah, and I think the important idea here is that that we can't just sort of will ourselves into thinking new thoughts without understanding the context that we're in.
Right.
So context that we can be in that will reinforce this kind of both and thinking, the ways that we will change our habits. I think about the atomic habits idea, James Clear, right? Like create the situation around you. That's what boundaries are, the scaffolding that will reinforce the way that you think about these competing demands. And importantly, to the work that you do, the most important of these is committing to purpose, committing to why. And we talk about it as a higher purpose. And what we mean by that is that the purpose encompasses the competing ideas. And in the work that we have done with leaders, the leaders that I worked with at IBM, a number of the leaders we've worked with, the most important thing, we did some work, and we might talk about this in a little bit, with Paul Pullman at Unilever. Paul Pullman made a very strong commitment to doubling profits through reducing their environmental impact by half and having a huge impact on the social and the people living at the bottom of the pyramid through doing those things. And he made a very strong commitment that purpose is the first and most important thing. The why is the most important thing because it continually reminds us why we're navigating these tensions. So that's number one. Number 2 and 3, I'll just say very briefly, is, and I'll just say these, but maybe the invitation is to go back to the book to unpack them because they're rich in how we think about them. One is separating and connecting, being able to pull apart these competing poles, understand each of them to find their interdependencies. And then the third piece is having clear guardrails so that you don't go too far off one side or the other.
It just really gives access. And for a lot of people, Wendy, I'm sure, you know this better than most. The idea of paradox might just scare the bejeebies out of them, never mind change. Paradox, my gosh. So I just really feel like you're just really helping equip us for what I've been referring to as a higher consciousness world. Just requires it.
I love that. I think that that's true because I think that the higher consciousness world is one in which we unpack that the world is founded on these interdependent opposites. We're always living in this ebb and flow. It's complicated. So how do we do it more effectively to lead to a better world?
I'm in for you. I'm with you. Let's do it together.
Yeah.
All right, let's grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Wendy Smith. She's the co-author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. We've been talking about the tools and applications of her work. After the break, we're going to turn more into how we can use it inside organizations. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. One other bit of news I want to share with you is that the anthology that I curated, it is now out. It's called Passionately Striving and Why. And it's a collection of stories from 25 women from around the world that I personally recruited to share their very intimate story of how they discovered their purpose and are now serving from it. So it's meant to be educational, inspirational, and inviting. So I hope you check that out as well. If you're just joining us today, my guest is Dr. Wendy Smith, the Dana J. Johnson Professor of Management and Faculty Director of the Women's Leadership Initiative at the Lerner College of Business and Economics, University of Delaware. She's the co-author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So for this next bit here, I want to go into a space, Wendy, that I really find precious in the work that I get to do, which is really around emotional intelligence. Being able to help develop that in people. A lot of people think they either have it or they don't. They don't recognize how much they can actually develop it. So I really appreciate what you wrote in your book about how underlying paradoxes trigger discomfort, right? So fear, anxiety, defensiveness. So if you could talk a bit about how we can manage our emotions as we're going through paradox.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. So even as we've been talking about emotional intelligence in leadership for a really long time, I think that we're still a little bit afraid of emotions in the workplace.
I agree completely, 100%.
Yeah, and increasingly it's refreshing when people talk about intuition or they talk about emotions and they talk about discomfort. It's really refreshing to see that emerge, and yet it's still a bit new, a bit novel.
Mm-hmm.
What we find in navigating paradox is that it is emotional. It is it triggers all kinds of defensiveness, and either we're feeling defensive because it's so complicated to think about or irrational, and we're uncomfortable with the irrationality of thinking about holding yes and no in the same space, or it's emotional because we, and as we were saying earlier, tend to have a particular point of view. And as soon as somebody else has an opposite point of view, it triggers us to defensively, it's an ego piece, right? We feel like we have to defend our point of view because if I'm right, you're wrong. And so there's all these emotions. And, on top of it, and this is, by the way, where the pandemic just really made this point so poignant, which is that part of navigating paradox is that there's all this uncertainty. We have to sometimes leave open decisions for longer than we want. And we don't, as a human species, like uncertainty. It's uncomfortable. The pandemic really showed us that. It was really uncertain, and there's a lot of anxiety to that. So in fact, we do point out that navigating paradox is hard. One reason it's hard is because it's emotional. Part of effectively navigating paradox is finding comfort in the discomfort. And importantly, that doesn't mean that we pretend the discomfort doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that we try and just sort of whitewash it away. It means that we own it, we accept it, we acknowledge it, and then through that experience, we are able to live with it. And here, I'm a huge fan of Tara Brach's work with her book, Radical Acceptance, with the idea that the more we can accept the uncomfortable things, the more effectively we can actually navigate through them.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate, again, how you give us tools. So you talk about building in pauses, having a space to be able to step back for a minute and say, okay, I got it. I am totally overwhelmed, scared out of my wits, whatever it is. Right. I appreciate that. And then accepting the discomfort, to your point there, just like, this is uncomfortable. I am navigating something totally new or beyond what I currently feel like I'm stretched to. And then the last one that I really appreciate is broadening our perspectives.
Yeah.
Being able to reach across the aisle to go, ooh, that I would never come up with that, but I can sort of see that.
Yeah. And even if I don't agree with it, I'm willing to just be curious about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's just such, and again, I just left a session before I came to get on air with you. I was doing a leadership development session this afternoon, and part of what we were talking about is reaching across the aisle to solicit the perspective of the other person, holding it, cherishing it, being curious about it, honoring it, and seeing what you can do with that versus, that's not what I would do, right? So we were just doing that this afternoon, just before it was a great warm up before I came to talk to you.
I love it. And the reminder that listening and being curious does not necessarily mean agreeing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, then now that takes us into this, one of my really favorite cherished things. It's one of my strengths and something that I can't help doing, and that's the learning piece.
Yeah.
And so you talk about how either or thinking can lead us to get stuck in ruts. And you say in response, we need both and thinking that enables us to learn, develop, and change. And of course, you offer 3 tools for that. So let's give that to our listeners and viewers.
Yeah. And so again, and one of the things, again, for your listeners, because there's Paradox 1.0, Paradox 2.0 notices that these tools that we're pointing out are actually paradoxical themselves. We say multiple times in the book that it's kind of like navigating paradox is paradoxical. So if you think about just at the individual level, you got to change what you think and also what you feel. Well, sometimes the thinking and feeling are in conflict with each other.
Mm-hmm.
At the context level, so we're talking about the context of scaffolding and boundaries and creating structures that allow us, that are sort of set and in place. And the extent that we know that the structures that are set and in place enable us to be dynamic, to be experimental, to try new things, to learn along the way. And that part of navigating these competing demands is this ongoing experimentation, questioning. This is, again, the image of the tightrope walker, where you're sort of shifting one way. As soon as you start going too far, you start shifting the other way. And somebody pointed out to me, by the way, that that standing is the same thing. Like we're never really standing still. We're always kind of, and we do it sort of, subconsciously. So on some conscious level, we think that we're sort of in this ongoing balancing. The question is, how can we make that conscious and be comfortable with that in our organizations and in our own personal lives?
So I like that, experimenting with measured steps, not going silly about the whole thing, but just experimenting with those measured steps. So I love that. And then, of course, the next one, I absolutely love experimenting with serendipity. Tell us more about that. That delights me.
Yeah. I mean, they say that, what is it, Louis Pasteur, luck finds the prepared mind, and that part of it is being open to what comes our way, right? So when I was thinking about academic versus practitioner, I had my whole life planned out in each of these paths, as opposed to how do I start down one of these and then be open to the possibilities that might emerge along the way. I had a great advisor when I was at Harvard, Ellen Langer, and she would always say, it's not about making the right decision. It's about making the decision right. Because as we move along the way, there's these sort of new shifts and turns that we have to constantly be open to in our sort of spirally lives.
And I delight in that, because if you're so focused on whatever the finish line is for you, that you miss that beautiful butterfly that just happened to show you the way, right?
Opportunity, this lucky opportunity that's coming your way that you don't even realize because you're too focused on where you're going.
And just holding that again, that tension again. And then this just came up today in the session. And so I told the group that I was interviewing you, and I would send the link on. But the importance of learning to unlearn. One of the participants was saying how he had learned some things, and when he was back in like elementary school or something, and he said, even today I recognize how they're holding me back. Yeah. So talk a bit more about what it is to learn to unlearn.
Yeah, right. And so again, if we stick to our current habits and our current mindsets and our current emotions, that's where we get stuck. We were talking about the S curve. That's where we get stuck on the existing S curve without expanding and seeing other S curves. Or that's where we get stuck down these ruts. So learning to unlearn is partially saying, what are the assumptions that I'm making that I have to let go of in order to experiment with new possibilities? And part of that is, the assumptions that we're making about our own identities, the assumptions that we're making about the habits that we have, about who I am in the world, and letting go of those, just letting go. This is part of the moving away from being controlling, a management style that's more controlling, to a management style that's able to cope and accept things as they come along the way.
Beautiful. So important, right? This ongoing learning process. Okay. Now, we want to bring all this together, Wendy. You and Marianne have created such a dynamic book, and then you have this last chapter that really just brings it home so beautifully. So I want to give access to our listeners and viewers to how they can develop their own organization into a paradox system. So you list, looks to me like about 8 different things here that I kind of want to just talk through a little bit here. Starting with, you talk about higher purpose, linking organizational tensions to higher purpose, which of course are boundaries, function as boundaries. Starting there, I presume.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe I can talk through the example that we use. One of the interesting decision choices that we had in this book was, who are we speaking to? This is kind of a big idea book. And our research started off by looking at leaders of organizations and how they navigated their organizational tensions. And as we started to unpack this work, we started working with colleagues that were doing work at the individual level and how they navigate their own individual tensions. So our last 3 chapters actually say, okay, well, what would it look like to apply these ideas at the individual level with a question that you have? The example that we gave is a career decision question. Right. What would it look like at the group level when there's groups in conflict with each other? And we give an example of Charleston, South Carolina, and how they navigated these tensions between citizens and police, which has been a huge issue in the United States, and the real political tensions that happened there and how they came together around that. And the example we use for the organizations is thinking about Paul Pullman, and we started to talk about him earlier, who it came to Unilever as the organization was what he called in an absolute downward spiral. Unilever is a packaged foods company, packaged goods company. They own hundreds of brands, Axe shampoo and Dove soap and Ben & Jerry's. And how did Paul Pullman turn the organization around through a commitment to sustainability, through a commitment to changing their environmental footprint through a commitment to being able to effectively think about the bottom of the pyramid and social impact. And it was through those commitments that they were able to double their profits. And again, where he started, and as we said earlier, was what is the higher purpose that we're working for? And for him, it was making sustainable living commonplace, making everyday living sustainable. And that motivated people to think about, how do we live in these ongoing tensions? Well, the next thing he had to do was say, well, what are the tensions? And he, would say that he told us, look, people like to kind of sweep the tensions under the rug because they're emotional, as we said. He would come to his leaders and say, hey guys, there's tensions here. If we surface them and work through them, we can come up with better, more creative solutions to the issues we're facing. So what are they? Let's put them on the table. And that was critical to him.
Mm-hmm. And that's honoring the discomfort, right? That's what you're speaking to, honoring the discomfort there. Is that right?
Partially he's honoring the discomfort. Partially he's surfacing and, in this idea of how do we change our mindset? One of the things we have to do in changing our mindsets is actually know that there's tensions, because oftentimes people just don't see them or don't want to see them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have guilty as charged. I have done that a few times in my life and paid for it.
Yeah.
Okay. So then if you want to stay with the Lieber example, first, let me ask, do you know what his tenure was? Paul's tenure?
He was there for 10 years. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. How long? What years? Do you remember?
2008 to 2018.
Okay. This sort of helps. Because certainly
he came in during the global downturn, the economic downturn. All of these packaged food companies, they had just bought up and acquired tons of other companies. There was an economic global downturn. I mean, he was just in the midst of a rut.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He's certainly, he's an icon in my world for all of that work. Well, then, if you can speak to Liebers, how did they build guardrails around paradoxical poles? How did they do that?
Yeah, so guardrails is our term for the structures that we create so that we don't go too far in either direction.
Mm-hmm.
And when it came to navigating people, planet, and profits, he had to make sure that he wasn't, and one of the things that happens particularly in social enterprises, smaller organizations, is that they might give up the profits in order to achieve their mission. He had to make sure that he was not doing that. But in large organizations like his, he has to make sure that the profits aren't overshadowing the commitment to people and planet and the broader mission. So how does he put people in place that are going to make sure that they haven't gone so far to profits, because profits are short term and profits are so demanding, that they lose sight of their mission? And so part of the thing that he did was he got rid of a whole bunch of people on his senior team that didn't understand the commitment to the sustainability goals. He switched up many people on his board who didn't understand that commitment. Part of it was making sure that there were people, there was a sustainability officer, Jeff Seabridge, who was there to make sure that the sustainability goals were really focused on and that they didn't lose sight of that. So those are the kinds of things that are the guardrails that leaders put in place to make sure that we are really focused on both of these goals.
Beautifully enunciated. Thank you. We won't be able to cover all of these, but let's just cover maybe one more. So you said he let go of a lot of people in the leadership as well as in the board. How did he diversify the stakeholders then? By replacing them with others with differing opinions or perspectives?
And I think I'm so glad you said that, because it's really one of the things that's important at an organizational level is that we do bring in diverse voices. That's where, and diversity is this double-edged sword. On one hand, diversity has this huge promise of bringing in new ideas. On the other hand, it can be hard to manage. So the value is bringing in different people with diverse ideas so that we can bring together these creative ideas and creating the conditions where they are comfortable, where they are involved, where they are part of the conversation, and inviting their voices into the conversation. And that was critical to what he did.
Mm-hmm. And takes a lot of skill. So listeners and viewers, there are several other pieces to what she has created. They have created in their model. So I just wanted to kind of give you some idea of just what's here. There's just so much richness that you can apply in your organization. So we've come to the end here, Wendy. I want to give you the chance to close the conversation and share what you'd like with the listeners and viewers, and say 15, 20 seconds if you can.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. And second of all, I think we know that both and thinking is not easy. And we know that we face a lot of problems in the world. And this is a way of shifting the way we think about our problems for some more creative, sustainable solutions. So we hope people can engage with these ideas and think more deeply about them.
That's why I had you on. I wanted to encourage it as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Wendy Smith, for being a guest on Working in Purpose. It is delightful to know you, to be elevated by your work, and sharing you with my listeners and viewers. Thank you.
Thank you. So fun to be here.
If you want to learn more about Dr. Wendy Smith, her research, or book, visit bothandthinking.net. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch a recorded podcast. We were on the air with Professor Salim Ali, a Pakistani-American Australian academic who is the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and the Environment at the University of Delaware. We talked about his incredibly ambitious and elevating book, Earthly Order: How Natural Laws Define Human Life. As I said with him on air, I felt like I was having a perfectly approachable and socially astute conversation with an encyclopedia. Next week, we'll be on with Kim Rohr, head of employee experience at Oyster, talking about how remote work and the opportunities it provides to build great careers and diverse organizations are available. See you there. Remember that work is an integral and important part of our lives and can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.